Okay. Good afternoon, members, and welcome to the first Development Charges Steering Committee kickoff meeting. Before we get into the presentation, I do need to do an election of chair and vice chair for this committee. So the floor is open now for nominations for chair of the Development Charges Steering Committee. Councillor Carlton?
I would nominate Councillor Woodbury.
Okay, thank you. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Keaveney? Thank you. Do I have any other nominations for chair of the Development Charges Steering Committee? Can I have a motion, please, to close nominations? Warden Hicks? Thank you very much. Councillor Woodbury, are you interested in standing as the chair of the committee?
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so I will declare Councillor Woodbury as the chair of the Development Charges Steering Committee. I will now open the floor up for nominations for vice chair. Councillor Carlton?
I would nominate Councillor Soever for vice chair.
Thank you very much. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Keaveney. Thank you. Are there any other nominations for vice chair? Seeing none, do I have a motion, please, to close nominations? Councillor Woodbury, thank you. Councillor Soever, would you be willing to stand as the vice chair?
Yes, I would.
Thank you very much. We have a vice chair and a chair. Chair Woodbury, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, I think. So now I'm going to have to really look, see where I have the agenda. Okay, so thanks everybody for being part of this committee. And going to be some interesting stuff, I think. So are there any, if there's any declarations of interest, you can declare now or at any time through the meeting. And we'll might as well move right on to the presentation from Hempson Consulting. Not sure who's going to.
I will do. Randy. I will do an introduction and then turn it over to Hempson. So good afternoon, everyone. So the county has retained the services of Hempson Consulting to help guide us through the development charge review process. And Hempson has been involved in previous development charge reviews with the county and therefore has great knowledge and understanding of the county as a whole. They've also been involved in the growth study update, and that growth information will be important for the development charges update, which we'll get into probably in future discussions with the steering committee. Hempson has been great to work with over the years. They've always made themselves available for any development charge related questions. I know Kevin and myself have always reached out to them, and they've always been great to respond to those questions. And so we've greatly appreciated their help and support over the years with respect to this development charges world, because it can be somewhat complex in terms of understanding it. And it's something that I know through discussions with Kevin and myself, we're always constantly learning with respect to development charges, and Hempson has always been there to support us, which is fantastic. So with us today is Rachel, Courtney, and Stefan from Hempson, and they will be going through a presentation that was set out in advance. And the presentation will provide an overview of development charges. We'll talk about the proposed work plan and discuss next steps. So with that, I'll turn it over to, I believe, Stefan, who will be going through the presentation.
Yes, thank you, Randy. And can everyone hear me? There's nodding of heads, that's great. Well, yep. Thank you very much, Randy. And thank you, Councillor Woodbury and members of this committee. My name is Stefan Cetrunovic, and I'm an associate partner at Hempson Consulting, and we do a lot of development charge work. And have done so for the county for many, many years. The county's first development charges bylaw was passed in 2006. And that was my first year at Hempson, and it was one of my first ever assignments. So this has been of long-standing interest to me as to how you've gone about doing things, and we're very, very pleased to be back here updating your bylaw and your background study this time around. I have Rachel Battaglia on the line, but Courtney King is not going to be with us this afternoon. But Rachel and I will be doing the vast majority of the technical background work for this particular study. And Rachel's also in charge of flipping the slide. So if we can go to the next one, please. Great, thank you. So Randy and Kevin had asked me today to provide a little bit of a sort of a development charges 101 backgrounder, and I apologize for those members of the committee who've done this before. Some of the next few slides will be sort of fairly straightforward and obvious to you, but we thought it would be best to just make sure that everyone was on the same page as far as what we're dealing with when we talk about development charges. And in particular, you know, things are somewhat different from the last time round. As I'm sure you're all aware, there's been a lot of legislative proposals that have been made by the provincial government in recent years relating to municipal finance, and in particular to development charges, and not just proposals, but reproposals and reproposals after that. And so it's been a rather confusing time for a lot of us, even those of us who are sort of following it very closely. And I want to just touch on where we're at with those recent legislative amendments and what it means for the county and for this particular background study. But ultimately, I'd like to focus in on how the county goes about imposing development charges, what they are, and what they're used to pay for here in Gray. And we'll also have a look at how the charges that you impose sort of stack up against other county jurisdictions, particularly the ones sort of that are you know, nearby, like Simcoe County, and some other places that are sort of similar in their growth patterns. And then finally, we'll talk about a little bit about the work plan and the steps we need to take under the statute in order to get a bylaw brought before you and ultimately before council. The next slide, please, Rachel. So what are development charges? Well, they are fees that are imposed on development to pay for growth-related capital costs. The operative words here are capital and growth-related. So we can only use the charges to fund capital expenditures, not operating expenditures. And we can only use them to fund capital to the extent that it is related to expanding infrastructure and facilities, or constructing new infrastructure and facilities to meet the needs of growth and development. The principle behind the charges is that the cost of expanding infrastructure and facilities should not be borne by the existing residents of Gray, but should be borne by the people who are triggering the need for those expenditures, and that is the growth and development itself. The county charges, of course, are not the only charges, development charges, that are imposed on developers up in Gray. So the area municipalities in Gray will also have their own charges for the services that they provide to development. And under the Education Act, school boards can also impose charges to pay for land for new schools as well. So, you know, from the perspective of the developer who goes to the counter and pulls a building permit, they pay actually 3 distinct charges. But what we are dealing with for this particular study is simply the charge that will be imposed by the county for county services. I just want to spend a few minutes describing how development charges sort of fits into the broader scheme of infrastructure funding that municipalities rely on. So those of you who are sort of familiar with the land development process will know that, when land is subdivided and a developer gets permission to subdivide and to rezone and ultimately construct, they are responsible for providing infrastructure within their subdivision or on lands immediately adjacent to the subdivision in order to bring the subdivision into the urban network and the network of municipal services. And those contributions are made through subdivision agreements and other types of agreements. And they, would sort of pay for internal roadways and sidewalks and street lights and local parks and that sort of thing, turning lanes off the main highway into the subdivision, that sort of thing. Development charges does not deal with that particular world of what we refer to as local services. The infrastructure and facilities that we're funding through the development charges framework have a much broader benefit to the community that extends well beyond one subdivision and can relate to a settlement area, a municipality, or more often than not, in the case of county services, the broader county as a whole. And development charges also only pay for the initial capital investment of that infrastructure. So, the vast majority of your capital budget will be devoted to maintaining your existing capital assets in a state of good repair. So the regular maintenance costs, repair costs, rehabilitation costs, and ultimately, setting aside funds to pay for the replacement of infrastructure at the end of its life cycle. All of those so-called life cycle costs are paid for outside of the development charge framework. That's your property tax that's going to be shouldering the majority of those particular costs. If we can go to the next slide, please. So when we look at the revenue tools that are available to municipalities to pay for growth-related capital, certainly development charges are front and center. They've been around for many decades, and there's been dedicated legislation in Ontario that regulating how these charges are to be imposed since 1989. As I say, they're used to fund the initial round of capital infrastructure, and they can only be imposed for certain services. And we'll get into the kinds of services that would be applicable in gray in a couple of slides' time. There are a few services that were eligible the last time we did this back in 2016 that are now ineligible, but none of these are, I believe, directly related to the county services. So municipal parking, municipal cemeteries, and municipal airports are now ineligible for DC funding, but that doesn't really concern us for this particular study. And I guess the other main change that's arisen out of the legislative amendments that were passed in September of last year is that previously there were certain services for which we could only fund a portion of growth-related capital, and the so-called soft services or discounted services, and that discount on those services has now been removed. And so there are many services for which a county imposes a development charge for which we can now use DCs to pay for the full 100% growth-related capital costs. So that's a win for many municipalities, certainly in my view. There are two other revenue streams that municipalities can rely on to pay for growth-related capital. I'll just deal with the right-hand column first. So there's long-standing provisions under the Planning Act, which allow municipalities to secure either by way of the dedication of land at specific rates, or payments, cash payments in lieu of the dedication of land that can be used for public parkland use. and the so-called Section 42 or parkland acquisition provisions of the Planning Act were set to undergo some changes by the government, and those changes have been rolled back so that the final version of the legislation that was passed last year actually keeps intact, for the most part, the old rates for securing parkland by municipalities. But what's really new, if we look in the middle of the page here, the middle column there, is this new authority under Section 37 of the Planning Act for municipalities to impose community benefits charges. These can be used to pay for, like DCs, they can be used to pay for the initial capital cost of infrastructure. The legislation is designed to allow a fair amount of overlap between the CBC and the DC revenue streams. But they can only be charged by local municipalities, so we won't be dealing with them at the county level. But I did want to make you aware that they exist, that your local municipalities may well be exploring them. There are limitations on how they can be used, so they can only be imposed on mid-rise and high-rise apartment buildings. And they are capped at 4% of the site value for any particular community benefits charge that's payable. One of the committee members has his hand up, and I'm happy to answer questions as we move forward, but I'll leave it to the chair to make decisions about that.
Sure, you could. That's whichever way works for you best. Councillor Soever.
Yes. On the parkland acquisition, it says it's 5%, and I know we've had the discussion here that under the Planning Act, the maximum you can ask for 5%. But I see on your presentation, there's an alternative higher rate may apply based on units per hectare. And actually, that's what we do have in our official plan. There is a per unit rate there, which is the aspiration. And the discussion we've had here is, okay, can you actually ask for more than 5%? Or is the 5% a cap in the Planning Act?
So through you, Mr. Chairman, the alternative rate is just that. It's an alternative to the standard rate of 5%. As you say, in order to implement the alternative rate, which for residential is 1 hectare of parkland per 300 housing units, you have to have a provision, an enabling provision in your official plan, which it sounds like you have. So I think it sounds to me like all of the elements are in place for you to pursue this. But the one thing I would say about the alternative rate is that the most important change to the legislation that took place last year is that once you implement the alternative rate, it is appealable now to LPAT. Oh. And so that introduces a new wrinkle to that wasn't there before.
Just further to that as well, before adopting the official plan policies that enable that higher rate, the municipality also has to prepare what's called a parks plan that examines the need for the parkland within the municipality. So there are some steps you need to do to get to that alternative higher rate, but there are provisions under the Act that do allow for that to occur. And as Stefan indicated, they are appealable under the Planning Act.
Okay, and Mr. Chair, so is there a cap on that alternative higher rate, or can you move it up to wherever you want?
Yeah, the cap is the 1 hectare for each 300 dwelling units, is my understanding, in terms of the cap under the Act.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And perhaps just to be clear too, that through this particular assignment, we have not been tasked to examine the parkland rate. So that doesn't fall under the umbrella of what we've been retained to do, or what's required under the DC statute to pass a background study and a bylaw. So the next slide, please. When we look at development charges more closely, DCs are imposed by bylaw, and the maximum life of a development charges bylaw is 5 years after the day it comes into force. The county actually has 2 bylaws. Both of them expire on the 1st of January 2022. So that is our hard deadline for getting things done. You will need to pass new bylaws in advance of that date. And if you don't, then you will not be able to impose charges from January the 2nd, 2022. The 2 bylaws, one deals with the roads and related infrastructure that fall within a roadway. And then you have another bylaw that deals specifically with the other services, the general services DC bylaw. The reason for having 2 bylaws is really to, well, for 2 reasons. One is that the roads component of the development charge in gray is the most substantial component. And so having a separate bylaw allows you to amend the roads charge without altering the charges for the other services. It can be easily done if it's in a separate bylaw. Also, it does protect you somewhat from appeals, because if somebody has an issue with specifically the roads charge, or perhaps one of the general services, it will be that bylaw that's appealed, and the other bylaw is protected from that appeal. So there's a strategic element to this as well. Before you pass a new bylaw, you have to undertake a background study, and that's what we've been retained to assist you with. And you have to hold at least 1 public meeting. And as I say, after you pass the bylaw, there's a 40-day period where anyone can appeal the bylaw, and those appeals are also adjudicated at the local planning appeal tribunal. Development charges are imposed on services, and the new legislation lists what services are eligible for DC funding. And we've put the full list up on the screen here, but we're really only concerned with the ones on the left, because those are the county services. The ones in the middle will be dealt with through the area municipal DC bylaws, and then the ones on the right are not really applicable in Grey County, at least right now. And so when we look at the left-hand services, right now you have charges for most of these services, but not all. And we've been having discussions with your staff all day yesterday and this morning about, which services would be appropriate to look at for imposing a charge. As I say, certainly services related to a highway, that's your roads and public works facilities. Land ambulance, you have a charge. Long-term care, where we've certainly become aware that there are significant plans for long-term care expansion that perhaps were not being contemplated 5 years ago. Children's services, housing services, provincial offenses services for sure. Parks and recreation services, which in the county context would cover expansion to the county trail network. And then we've also looked at transit at the same time, but I think the feeling is right now that it may be a little premature to be at least calculating a development charge for transit, at least while there's a pilot program underway, and you'd want to see the results of that pilot program before you committed significant capital dollars to transit expansion.
I think we have another question from Councillor Soever.
Yes, on the services related to proceedings in the provincial, it says municipally administered court services. So how does that deal? And there isn't that in the area municipal bylaws. So if in the case of a lower tier where that institutes administrative penalties and has costs with the administration of that, where would that come in? And what is municipal, well, I guess my question is, what does municipally administered court services cover?
So through you, Mr. Chairman, that would cover all of the capital expenditures made by the county to provide facilities, furniture and equipment, land, or any capital related items to provide hearing space and legal support to proceedings under the Provincial Offences Act that the county is responsible for. To the extent that there are operating costs shared between the county and local municipalities, just remember that the development charges can't be used to pay for operating costs. So I'm not sure that would apply in this case.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. The legislation is quite prescriptive about the steps required to undertake a background study. And I'll just take you relatively quickly through this, but just so that you know the sequence of analysis that's required to get from A to B. Step one then is to do a forecast of future development, the amount, the type, and the location of development. Step two is to look back over the last 10 years and determine what the level of service has been for each of the services for which we are calculating a charge. The historical level of service over the last 10 years sets a limit on how much we can use, how much we can fund moving forward over the future planning horizon. The third step then is to, once we understand what our historical service levels are and we have some sense of where and how much the growth is going to be, is to identify the infrastructure and facilities that are going to be needed to provide services for that growth. And we need to identify the costs associated with those works. We have to identify any external funding sources for those costs. We have to identify any portion of those costs that are going to benefit the people who are already living here in Gray. And that so-called benefit to existing component is ineligible for DC funding. We have to account for any development charge reserve funds that the county has on hand that can be used to fund these costs. And then to the extent that there may be large infrastructure that will provide a benefit beyond the planning horizon that we're looking at into the future, we have to account for that so-called post-period benefit as well. And after making all of those deductions, we're left then with the costs that are eligible for development charge recovery. And they are recovered through a charge on residential development that is a charge per unit, with higher charges for the larger unit types and lower charges for the row houses and the apartment units. It's also recovered on the non-residential sector as a charge per square meter of gross floor area. And in the county, you do not impose that particular component of the charge. So no commercial or industrial or institutional development pays the charge here in Gray.
We have a question from Councillor Soever again.
Yeah, so on the historical service levels and identifying capital items. Now, one of the items that, is a capital need in the future. And in fact, some municipalities are now requiring developers to put in conduit for fiber. We at the county have been, funding SWIFT programs, which then SWIFT turns around and then gives grants they get funding from other sources as well. but they turn around and they give grants to people to install, fiber, which is a capital item. And so where would that, like, are there any municipalities that charge development charges for the provision of telecommunications, like fiber services?
So through you, Mr. Chairman, well, the answer to the first question is yes. I certainly think that fiber is an eligible capital cost. I am aware of some municipalities that include those costs in their development charge calculations. And I think that in this particular case, we discussed this a little bit yesterday with staff. The best place to recover those costs would be through the roads charge, because a lot of that fiber will be laid and dealt with through road reconstruction type work, where you're getting under the roadway and you may be also at the same time replacing pipes or dealing with drains and in this context laying telecommunications fiber or conduit.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Keaveney.
Thank you, Chair Woodbury. And I'm just wondering if I could ask about the non-residential sector we're not charging. And just if you could share some reasoning why we're not, if you recommend that we don't, and what comparator counties do most others charge or not charge?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chairman. I had intended on, there's a few slides coming up that will provide a bit more context about what other counties do. So I can certainly speak to that in a little bit, but in terms of the county's policy, this has been long-standing. It's been the case since right from the get-go in 2006. I believe that the main rationale for it was to provide an economic development incentive to non-residential development, and there was certainly when we were doing the 2011 study, which was immediately after the 2008-2009 recession. There was a strong belief at the time that the county shouldn't be seen to be imposing any sorts of fees or charges on particularly industrial development, and so that was part of the rationale at that particular time. I should stress, and I have always done this throughout this process, is that when you exempt a certain type of development from the development charge, you cannot increase the charge on other forms of development in order to pay for the exemption. So the funding of the exemption comes from the property tax base, the existing residents. It doesn't come from other developers. So I think, Rachel, if we can go to the next slide, please. One element of the background study that will involve this committee will be the requirement that the background study consider the use of area-specific development charges. Area rating is often done in municipalities to reflect the different needs of services in different areas. And it's more often than not done in the context of where services are being provided in undeveloped areas. So where the urban settlement area is being expanded into so-called greenfields, where pipes are being extended for the first time into areas, and stormwater ponds are being constructed for the first time to deal with newly developed land. You don't provide water, sewer, and stormwater services. So the services that are almost exclusively charged in this manner are not services that we're dealing with here at the county level. And when you look at the county services, it's very difficult to really sort of delineate an area which benefits exclusively from certainly provincial offences or housing or children's services. But even when we look at the roads, to the extent that particularly with county roads, these are network improvements, and it's very difficult to sit down on a map and draw a line around the benefiting area associated with one particular road segment. So it's practically unheard of in Ontario to have area-specific charges for roads and for the county services. And certainly my recommendation would be that you continue to adopt a county-wide approach for the services that you deliver. But we, we are required to consider it. And that's why I'm raising it today. And at some point during this process, I would expect that we will be bringing a resolution to this committee to determine, which way forward you'd like to proceed.
Councillor Soever?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if you do go down this road and you get a different development charge because the service is different, or the need for the service is different, do you not then run the risk of having that service being a special service and then having to delve into the issue of special area services in terms of your taxation?
Well, through you, Mr. Chair, I mean, I think it's an excellent question. I don't think there's a requirement to do it, but I'm sure that it begs the question. There are a lot of jurisdictions that have area-specific charges that don't have special areas for taxes. So that it's certainly not required in that respect.
Okay, I was just wondering how that in relationship is. Thank you.
I think the next slide, please. The current charge in Grey County, the residential charge, if we look on the right here, you'll see it's a charge of $7,500 per single or semi-detached dwelling unit, and a $5,200 charge for a townhouse, and a $4,400 charge for an apartment unit. And then there is a separate standalone charge of $2,700 for a wind turbine development. And if you look at the pie chart, you can see that the overwhelming majority of the charge is used to fund the roads and related service. There are smaller charges for the land ambulance and some of the other services as well, but essentially this is a roads charge. And further to the councillor's earlier question about what other counties do. So we've got a couple of slides here just showing you what other county jurisdictions charge for. And you can see, the grey charge is more or less in the middle of the pack here. Simcoe is higher, but Simcoe is also growing rapidly and has some quite significant infrastructure requirements in order to meet the demands of that growth, particularly on the road side. So that charge is about $10,000 a unit. And in Peterborough, County of Peterborough, it's around $8,500 a unit. But again, that is mostly a roads charge. And then, there are places like Dufferin, Wellington, and then we've just calculated a charge for Elgin County. This would be the first ever charge they'd imposed if they pass it, that are somewhat lower than the charge we have in Grey. And in Middlesex, they don't currently have a development charge at all. I've put Oxford County here, but I should note that the Oxford charge also includes a water and sewer component, which is why it's at the top of the list.
Okay. Another question, Councillor Soever.
Yes, so looking at these comparisons, of course, there are different levels of service in different counties. Like, for instance, Simcoe does waste disposal, and then other counties do countywide policing and things like that. So are these numbers, these are just raw numbers, right? There's been no adjustment made to compare the service levels.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, you're absolutely right, Councillor. I mean, this does not account for levels of service, we've tried to, make sure we're comparing jurisdictions that have a similar range of services that are provided, but levels of service this does not pick up. And you rightly point out that, that would, well, it'd be rather difficult to do in this type of comparison. So certainly take this kind of thing with a grain of salt. It's for comparative high-level purposes. Nor indeed does this comparison show you what the impact is on the individual developer. Because remember, the developer is paying not just the county charge, but also the area municipal charge and the education charge. So we shouldn't be using this to assess the impact on the developer in any given jurisdiction. But we can certainly provide, that sort of information as we move through this process. The next slide then will show you the same comparison with the same comparators for development charges on commercial development. And again, Grey and Middlesex do not currently have a charge, but most of the others do. And Simcoe again leads the way with a $38 per square meter charge. And on the industrial side, we find that there are more municipalities that will exempt industrial development outright. So Grey is certainly not unusual in that particular respect. But again, in Simcoe, Wellington, Dufferin, and Elgin, they do either have a charge or are considering a charge for industrial development. I just wanted to go through the steps towards passing a bylaw. So the background study itself has to be released to the public 60 days prior to passing the bylaw. And so if we think about December being a time when we would bring a bylaw to a county council, then the background study would have to be released sort of the first week of October, ideally. And we would probably aim to have a public meeting in November. And there are certain notification requirements for that public meeting, including releasing a draft version of the bylaw 2 weeks in advance of the public meeting. So that would probably be released after the background study, but certainly before the public meeting. And we would want to make sure that we left a sufficient time between the public meeting and bringing the bylaw forward to respond to any submissions that we received at the public meeting and making any amendments to the bylaw that would be required. And then after the bylaw is passed, there are also notification requirements as well. And like I said, there's an appeal period and some other administrative matters that we have to do. But those would be in the new year of 2022. Just wanted to then take you through some of the key provisions of the bylaw. And so, when we think of this process as a whole, we can think of it in two sort of sections. The first section will be the technical analysis associated with the background study. And that is underway. And as I say, we've met with staff over the last couple of days to start gathering data and examining how that technical analysis is going to be done. And then the second part of this is, once we know what the maximum charges could be imposed, is then to work with you to establish what the most appropriate charges are, who should pay for them and who should not pay for them, and the other kinds of policy matters that go into crafting a bylaw. And so wanted to just start this discussion by laying out for you what's in the current bylaw. So, there are exemptions from the payment of DCs that are statutory. So school boards and municipalities don't pay DCs on any of their buildings. Industrial development does not pay a development charge on any expansion to an industrial building. provided it's below 50% of the size of the original building. And there are also statutory exemptions for secondary units in residential buildings, whether those units are attached to existing buildings and whether they're newly constructed or pre-existing. And some of those changes are new. They're arising from the legislation passed last year. And then on top of the statutory exemptions, there are exemptions that the county imposes off its own bat. And so public hospitals are exempt, institutional church uses, agricultural uses, farm buildings, accommodation for seasonal or temporary agricultural laborers, the commercial industrial uses we've discussed. And then, as you're aware, I'm sure, there was a suite of exemptions that were proposed and passed by council very recently, dealing with purpose-built rental and nonprofit housing in the county. And Randy is here and has an encyclopedic knowledge about the details about those exemptions, and I'm sure can answer any questions about those. The next slide then, please. Other provisions in the bylaw is that there are provisions to ensure that the development charges are indexed to keep pace with the rising costs of construction. And the indexing is done annually on January the 1st. There are provisions in the bylaw to deal with situations where redevelopment occurs on an existing site. So where a house, for example, is demolished, provided you rebuild within 5 years on the same site, you're exempt from payment of the development charge. I mentioned right from the get-go that local services internal to a subdivision are not funded through development charges. And we're going to be developing local service guidelines for the roads service in this background study to just lay out for everybody, particularly developers, what they will be responsible for when they subdivide, and what they can expect to pay for when they pay a development charge. So there's a bit of transparency brought to what falls in and out of a local service. And then there are also provisions in the bylaw that enable specific provisions in the Act, one of which is that allows the county to strike agreements with developers to alter the timing of the payment of the development charge. And I know this is a provision that will come into play in some of the new exemptions and discounts that you recently approved.
Okay, we have a question from Warden Hicks. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm back at slide 14, and I apologize for that. But on slide 14, at the very bottom, it talked about the pamphlet, the DC pamphlet.
Yeah, I think it's slide 13, maybe.
Yeah, on mine it said 14, but nevertheless, there we are, the DC pamphlet. Is that statutorily mandated?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chairman, it is. Although it doesn't need to be a printed pamphlet, it can be on the website. So it's really website content about what the charge is imposed for, and the areas to which the charge applies and some of the exemptions. And so it's a sort of summary of the bylaw policies that you have to make available to the public.
Right. And I'm assuming that 60 days is to allow the 40-day appeal period, and then some time for you to put together the pamphlet based on whatever the outcome of the appeal is.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure that there is a direct relationship between those two periods, because I'm not sure that you'd be able to resolve an appeal, certainly in the current context, within the 20 days between the 40 and the 60. So I'm not sure that there is actually a link there, but it's a good point.
I would assume that if you were printing, you wouldn't want to go through the expense, I suppose, of producing a pamphlet, knowing that there was still an appeal that might impact what you print.
Oh, yes, no, you're right in that respect. Yes, I understand. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. That's it.
I should also mention, I know this is a crowded slide and I don't propose to go through it in great detail, but and this particular item really relates more to your local municipalities. The development charge under the Act, responsibility for collecting the development charge and determining what the charge is in any circumstance falls to your local municipalities. They collect the money on your behalf and they remit the money monthly to the county treasurer. And there have been some changes made to the way the charges are determined, and for certain types of development, how they're paid. And so as of last year, well, up until last year, the default timing of payment was the date at which the building permit was issued. Someone would come in, get their building permit issued, and they would pay their development charge. And the charge that was owing was whatever the charge was on that particular date. The new legislation freezes the charge that will be payable based on the date at which a developer secures an approval for their rezoning or for their site plan application. And provided they secure a building permit within 2 years of that approval, they will pay the charge that is backdated to that approval. So the charge stays frozen for a period of time. The purpose of introducing that was to, in the government's words, provide a bit more certainty to developers as to what they were going to pay in development charges when they actually came around to paying it. And that certainty would be obviously when they secured their approval for to develop. The issue with that is that the legislation also allows municipalities to charge interest on the frozen payment. And so I believe that part of what your recent approvals was to approve an interest rate for those freezes. And in most cases, the interest rate has been determined to try and offset any lost revenue that might arise from the freeze. So it may turn out that developers are paying pretty much the same as they always did in the past. But it's certainly going to create an administrative burden for the local municipalities who now have to track what the frozen payment is for each development that comes in. The second complication is that for rental housing, institutional development, and nonprofit housing, they are required to make their payment in annual installments from the first point of occupancy of the development. So in rental housing and institutional development's case, that would be 5-year annual installments. And in the case of nonprofit housing, it'll be 20-year annual installments. So that too is going to require some tracking by the lower tier municipalities to ensure those are paid in the correct manner, recognizing that the volume that we're dealing with here is probably it's certainly a lot lower than for the DC freeze side of things. But and some of the recent amendments to your bylaw that you just passed are aimed to mitigate the problems arising from these deferrals. So that's a very, you're well ahead of the game, I can assure you, when it comes to other municipalities in dealing with this.
Warden Hicks, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to be clear, who exactly fixes the interest rate?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, it's the municipality that does. It's not a prescribed rate under the legislation. Municipalities have been given the authority to set their own rates.
So that's the lower tier then?
Well, it would be the upper tier for your charge, and it would be the lower tiers for their charges.
So I'm confused. Can the So can the county have one rate and then the municipality have a different rate?
That's correct.
But then that's calculated by the lower tier because they're collecting it.
That's correct.
And okay, and then I gather that the lower tier makes the calculation, collects it, and then apportions so much to the upper tier and so much they keep.
That's correct. Yeah, it's actually typically two separate payments that'll be made. So,
thank you for that.
The next slide, please. Rachel, can we go to the next slide? Maybe we've lost, we may have lost connection there.
I think she's frozen.
Ah. Well, I think the next slide is pure text, so I'm going to speak to it. We'll just wait a minute to see whether she's able to relog on, which she seems to be doing. But in any case, the next slide deals with getting into our work plan. And I wanted to just set out for you how we saw the key decision points that this committee might need to make between now and December. Our proposal is that at some point, well before the background study is drafted, we bring to you a list of the growth-related capital works that we propose to base the charge calculations on, and that we secure your approval to draft a background study on the basis of those works. The legislation requires that the works in the background study be a reflection of council's intentions to provide services in the future. And so we're going to ensure that the works are tied back to your existing 10-year capital forecast, your master planning documents, and where there are cases where works are not expressly tied back to pre-existing studies, we'll make clear to you why staff feels that there's a need for certain types of work. So that will all be laid out for you, but we're going to ask for your direction to proceed on a background study on the basis of the works that you will see in advance.
Okay, Councillor Soever.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On the capital works, you say those are based on the approved works and the approved plans and everything. How current do those plans have to be? Like, say for instance, your master transportation plan dates back more than 5 years, and like, how current do those plans have to be, and do they have to be approved by council?
So through you, Mr. Chairman, the Act doesn't speak to this. All it says is that the works must be an expression of council's intentions, and the regulations to the Act state that those intentions can be expressed either through an official plan or a capital forecast or a similar expression of intent. And so, my view is that, we work with the best information that we have available at the time the background study is done. There are many cases where we have to do a roads program in the absence of a transportation master plan altogether. Not everyone has one. In your case, it's a little bit dated. It was last done in 2015. We spent most of this morning actually going through those works and seeing which ones, perhaps had changed in priority or timing or costs. And so we're going to be doing sort of analysis over the next month to try and update that somewhat, but I think the feeling is that that master plan is still pretty robust. And although there'll be changes perhaps to the timing of the works and some of the scope, that it's certainly good enough to proceed with for background study purposes.
Thank you.
The second matter that, of course, you'll be asked to consider is this area rating. And I think this is something that we're going to have to get direction from you sooner rather than later. As I say, my recommendation would be that given the general approach taken in Ontario to roads development charges and other county services, that you should continue to proceed with a county-wide development charge. And I would recommend that this committee pass a resolution to that effect so that we can move forward with all the technical analysis on that basis. You'll also be asked at some point, probably in the fall, whether you wish to hold more than one public meeting. You're not required to do that, but you are required to resolve not to do that, shall we say. And then, of course, I'm sure that this committee will be involved in options for implementing the charges once you've seen what they are, whether that means you want to implement the fully calculated rates or some discounted rate. There are phase-in options and, of course, exemptions and discounts and so on and so forth. The last slide here then sets out the sort of the timing that we're hoping to follow here. And so we are, we have done the background review and information requests. We've kicked off with staff. We are nearing the end of preparing the growth forecast. And we have conducted one-on-one interviews with all of the department heads with respect to service level information. We are hoping through May to finalize the service level calculations and prepare the list of capital works. And that will allow us to prepare draft DC rates, and we're hoping to bring those to you before the summer so that you can have a look at them. And it's at that point we're hoping to get your direction to proceed with a background study, which we will prepare over the summer. And it will, so that it can be released, as I say, maybe late September, early October, and that will take us into that sort of period of time where the statute takes over and we start having to follow statutory timeframes up until the bylaw is passed in December. And so that, I think, concludes the slide deck. Rachel, have I got that right? Yeah, these are the next steps, which I just discussed. And I'm certainly happy to answer any further questions that you may have. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I've been involved with, excuse me, the development charges with our municipality over the years. That was a good review and update, so very much appreciated. Are there any other questions from staff or committee members? Okay, that answered a lot right away.
Mr. Chair,
there we are.
Warden Hicks, yes.
Yeah, Warden Hicks, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Stefan, for that presentation. And by the way, don't assume that we really know. The 101 lecture is very much appreciated, at least from me. So you are recommending that we continue to adopt a countywide approach for the services that we provide, and maybe through staff, when is the appropriate time to bring such a motion for us to have that debate? I would say let's move it along, but I don't want to, if a motion is necessary at this time, I'm quite prepared to bring that motion and have us have the debate and make the recommendation. But I don't want to do it at an inappropriate time. Is this the appropriate time?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm wondering if it's probably the next steering committee meeting that we have that motion, but I'll look to Stefan or anyone else, maybe Kevin, in terms of thoughts with respect to when we have that motion. As Stefan indicated, we'll have some of the draft charges at that time for the next steering committee meeting, and whether or not we want to then have that motion on the area rate specific matter. But happy to take the direction from the committee if they want to provide that direction even at this early stage, is to continue calculating on a county-wide basis. That will help from a staff perspective anyways, to continue as we're providing some of this background data and information to Hempson to calculate that draft charge. That direction could very easily happen now as well. So further thoughts on that, Stefan or Kevin?
Well, through you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it would be great to get a resolution today. Certainly that would clear things up for us. But as Randy said, it won't affect our timelines if we can secure that resolution in the next time we meet. And we may well have additional technical information that could help answer questions if there are any about it.
Sure. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm hearing that it's the recommendation of the consultant. I'm assuming it's also the recommendation of staff. I would say let's get on with it. It's what we're doing currently. It's just really a motion that says we are prepared to adopt continuing what we're currently doing. And I don't see us potentially moving any other way, but maybe I'm wrong. And I would say, let's just do it today. But if staff is of the belief that there's some additional information that might influence that decision, that's important for us to hear, and we won't have it until the next meeting, then so be it.
I think I'd like to get kind of Heather's take on it too, of whether procedurally it's in order.
Oh, can I ask Rachel to just stop sharing her screen just so we can see everyone? That would be terrific if the slide presentation is done. Thank you. And I will actually look to Randy or Kevin, but I don't see Kevin here.
Yeah, he's here.
Yeah, he's here. Oh, there he is. Yeah, thank you. As to whether additional information would be helpful to the committee in the next staff report. And I know we're going to be looking at another meeting within the next probably month or so at the latest, whether the background information would be able to provide the committee members with a bit more background information, and the report then would include a staff resolution as well.
I guess I'll start. I think the discussions that we've had, as Stefan indicated, we've met with all the various departments yesterday and today. At this stage, there's nothing that's indicating that we would differ from previous how we've dealt with the area rate charge. There's no specific projects or initiatives that we flag that would, I think, trigger a service that would be area specific, for example. So I think the way, based on those even preliminary discussions, I don't anticipate any recommendation from a staff perspective anyways that would differ from what the consultant is recommending in terms of keeping it a county-wide specific area rate charge. Thinking back on what I said earlier in terms of coming forward at the next meeting, this, if a motion was passed today, it would definitely help to provide some, I guess, guidance and direction even at this early stage to staff when we're gathering the data and information and thinking about some of those capital projects that we'll obviously having some further discussions with this committee on as well. But it may help to provide that background information and guidance early in the process. So I'm thinking it may be helpful and beneficial to have it in the early stage. But Kevin, I don't know if you have any thoughts.
No, but I was going to actually turn to Heather as well. When we didn't have a motion or a report here with that in it, is there any concern? That's all. So.
So through you, Mr. Chair, coming from the presentation today, there's certainly an opportunity for a motion to be presented. I love doing them on the fly. So So we can, if that is the wish of the committee, we can certainly do that to move the business of this committee forward, to bring it to the next committee. It's up to the committee what they wish to do. I need a little bit more wording, and I'll work with Monica on that resolution.
I can certainly help, Madam Clerk. I think if I'm reading properly, it would be this steering committee making a recommendation to council. So there's still an opportunity for council to adopt or not adopt the recommendation of this committee. So really today's motion, if I'm reading it properly, and maybe I will bring a motion and we can see if there's a seconder, and just let's move on with it. So my motion will be that this committee recommends that the County of Grey continue to adopt a county-wide approach for the services we provide. And I'll leave it there. So that the County of Grey continue to adopt a county-wide approach for the services we provide.
Okay. Do we have a seconder for that? Okay, Shirley will second that. Any discussion? Randy?
Just further to that, and maybe look towards Stefan in terms of the consideration of the area rate specific matter. Do we need to include something in the motion with respect to referencing that area rate language?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chairman, I was just sort of noting down, it may be better, Mr. Warden, to just add to your motion by a preamble saying pursuant to section 10 brackets 2 C.1, comma, and then your motion. And just make sure that your motions, that the County of Grey continue to impose development charges.
Right, and so at the end, it would say pursuant to section 10 sub 2 C.1.
Yes, of the Development Charges Act.
And then that still allows us to deal separately, I'm assuming, with the, I'm forgetting the word, the area. What is the word that I'm looking for, Randy?
It's area rate specific, and that is the section that's dealing with the area rate specific matter. So basically, this direction would be we're not considering an area rate specific charge. We're looking at it as on a county-wide basis.
Excellent. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Good. Okay, any other discussion? Is anyone opposed to that motion? Seeing none, that is carried. Thank you. And I think with how these have to go back through council and things, I think that was a really good idea to get things moving and that. Councillor Soever, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Just like to go back to the presentation while we were discussing the wording here. I went and looked. I thought I had copied the wrong presentation, but I see now that the presentation that was given here is a little different than the presentation that's on the web. So I'm looking at page 19 in May. If we could bring that back up, that'd be great. Because the one I printed out only has calculate draft rates, but I thought I saw in the presentation that was on the web some other things for May. I may be wrong, but it disappeared. But yeah, so in May it says finalize service levels and capital program, and yeah, so this chart is different, quite different than the one that we have from the web. So I'm wondering if we could maybe get the updated one just so we have that.
Yep, good idea.
For sure. We'll update the one in the council portal and on the website.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Okay, any other questions? All right, we'll go back to the agenda now. We've covered next steps, I believe. Other business. Don't think there is on this. And then next date will be, next meeting, that date will be arranged in the future. Okay, was there anything else that we needed to discuss or do with this? Nope.
I think we're good.
Great, thank you. Just need motion for adjournment then. Okay, moved by Sue, seconded by LR. Okay, and anyone opposed? So never get a hand for that. One of these times at council, I'm going to ask for a recorded vote. So keep an eye on me, Heather.
Shaking her head.
If you line up enough people, we can actually defeat the motion.
That's a good idea. I like that.
No, please.
Then what?
Thank you, everybody.